Roadhouse is a film second to none in its unabashed insistence on being entertaining. Scorned by critics, punished for decades, and labeled a joke for having the temerity, the hubris, to provide a solid bang for the audience's hard-earned buck. Never a dull moment with its dynamic brawls, chiseled heroes, over-the-top villainy, beautiful women, and satisfying roller coaster third act extravaganza of violence, for which it was labeled vile and sleazy by Karen James in the New York Times. Roadhouse isn't too much of a good thing, as much as it was the last film of the 1980s. Its earnesty rapidly losing currency to the more lugubrious feelings of the 1990s. Roadhouse is the story of Dalton, a stoic man of action and example. He's rather ascetic, as recompense for imagined sins of his past, a tragic moment in which his talent for violence went too far. He lives in a world of nightlife, of beautiful women, revelry, and fun, but he denies himself all of these things. He doesn't drink, save for the casual beer, opting instead for coffee.
Coffee black.
The beverage of alertness and productivity. And he does smoke, which is a rather brooding and contemplative pleasure. He's a guardian angel for the bar scene, protecting hard-working men and women from terror and chaos during the weekend. The weekend, that so sacred 2-day period for the working stiffs of all colors and creeds in America. This is our time to blow off steam, to engage in courtship, to wear our best clothes, to be seen and to celebrate life. Dalton makes that possible. A silent protector, a watchful guardian, with an exquisite mane of hair. He takes his licks with a sort of pride in his duty. Dalton's seeming imperviousness or indifference to pain drew a lot of ire from critics as being unrealistic, overly macho, etc. But what it really is an example of the Christian virtue of silent joy in suffering and persecution.
Do you enjoy pain?
Pain don't hurt.
Strength and contentment in the face of injustice, getting yelled at by a clueless customer and staying calm, getting reamed out by your boss while nodding your head yes and standing up straight. And it's not just any watering hole he protects, it's the Roadhouse where he plies his trade. The Roadhouse, the epitome of Midwestern fun. The Joel Osteen megachurch of saloons. Not quite a concert hall, not quite a bar. The title, Roadhouse, implies a lot. It's a bar on the side of the road. The miracle of the highway system allows patrons from all 50 states to have the opportunity to stop in for a visit, for a drink, for a dance, for a fight, which implies a diversity of customers, excitement of the new, as well as the danger of the unknown. You don't know who you'll see or what will happen when you stop in. Dalton is on the job in New York City when Tillman stops to see him. Like the peasants from the beleaguered village in Kurosawa's The Seven Samurai, he's hoping to gain the allegiance of a warrior, to bring peace and prosperity to his humble establishment. Dalton vacates his position with the New York club. Though dismissive to his employer,
I'm out of here.
we get the sense that his leaving isn't born from dissatisfaction exactly, but the knowledge that this town, Tillman's town, has not been settled, and that there is another patch of land out there that needs his help. He's been summoned to fulfill his continuing, seemingly never-ending mission. Tillman's Roadhouse, the Double Deuce, is a mess. Overrun with hooligans from within and without. Jeff Healey, the Blind House musical act, a real-life musician, is mercilessly pelted with beers. The facade is run down and shabby, and the out-of-control fighting reaches almost balletic heights before the place closes down at 2 a.m. Some of the most pleasurable moments in the film come from Dalton's ability not only to hold his own in a fight, but to manage a bar effectively. He spends his first night observing. The next day, he ceremoniously dismisses those employees who swipe from the till, drink on the job, or abuse their position to cavort in the broom closet.
Your history.
But I'm on my break.
The unfortunate paradox of bar ownership, and what the owner-operator will quickly need to realize, is that they must hover above their clientele in order to make it a success. By that I mean, you are surrounded by and in the business of providing a place for people to cut loose and relax, get wild maybe, and laugh. But you cannot do any of these things. In order to fit in and to endear yourself to regulars, you must perform a pantomime of excitement and merrymaking, But you yourself must remain clear-headed and sober, lest the place get away from you. As Ben Franklin said in his almanac, drive your business, or it'll drive you. Those looking to open a bar to have their own personal hangout will soon notice that all of your buddies and the pals of your buddies and your friends and pretty girls will all manage to cajole you into drinking for free. And before you know it, you've thrown a pretty expensive house party. Dalton then mentors and empowers those at the Double Deuce worth keeping. And like the Seven Samurai, who train millet farmers to be soldiers, Dalton trains up the bright-eyed bouncers into stone-cold enforcers.
Right boot.
Got it.
Employing his method with confidence, the art of de-escalation, of being nice.
I want you to be nice until it's time to not be nice.
And when that doesn't work, a good old-fashioned outside dust-up ass-kicking will suffice.
You're too stupid to have a good time.
And in no time flat, Tillman has become the proprietor of the new and improved Double Deuce. No more zoo animal cage around the band, no more riffraff, and newly painted walls. Unfortunately, there was one party they forgot to ask. Ben Gazzara's Brad Wesley, the big guy in the small town. Ben Gazzara plays disingenuous so well and takes such enjoyable glee in causing chaos. Wesley is a bad dude, and he runs a bunch of bad boys. One of them, his nephew, was canned by Dalton, and retribution is swift.
Mr. Tillman may own this bar, but the liquor he serves is supplied to him by Brad Wesley. Pat McGurn is in the employ of Mr. Wesley, his uncle, not Mr. Tillman.
It's after this melee that Dalton realizes he's disturbed the primal forces of this small town. And in order to save the bar, he must save Joplin, Missouri, and its people. A tall task. People like the browbeaten small businessman Red Webster, who is forced to fork over protection money to Wesley's racket under the risible guise of community improvement. This was the boogeyman of many horror films of the 70s and 80s, the small-town sheriff on a power trip, or the cabal of hillbillies far from the reach of the law who torment visitors from the big city. Think Deliverance, Dead and Buried, or Motel Hell. Victims are left with no recourse to a higher authority. And so, in the microcosm of Joplin, Missouri, Wesley is basically the federal government. A monopoly power adverse to anyone stepping on his authority, usurping his right to rule. His victims are mostly small shop proprietors. The Double Deuce, Red's Repair Shop, the local car dealer. It's a stretch, I'll admit, to interpret the driving of a monster truck over a car lot as a metaphor for the crushing, quote-unquote, influence of regulation on small business that Reagan railed against, but I'm going to go for it. Dalton makes a home for himself in Joplin, one he thinks is temporary. He buys an old beater, knowing that when he lays down the law, he will make enemies and incur retribution. He rents out the upstairs of an old barn. Honestly, a totally swinging pad, and befriends a salt-of-the-earth farmer in the process, from which he's granted a view of Brad Wesley's lavish estate. And of course, after a couple of beatings, Dalton makes a visit to the local hospital, where he encounters Elizabeth Clay, a doctor who we might assume is a transplant, like Dalton, going where the work is, where she's needed, but definitely not a Joplin native. She's sophisticated and smart, disapproving of Dalton's work and milieu, but approving of his ethos. They begin to fall in love. There are 3 women in the world of Roadhouse: Dr. Clay, the urban transplant to the Midwest; Carrie, the waitress at the Double Deuce, who buddies up to Dalton. She's cute and wholesome, and oogles Dalton in a sort of titillating way when she brings him breakfast, giving him the lowdown on the area, but in reality, she's really just one of the boys. And then there's Denise, played by Julie Michaels. This is one of her few films, but I really like her in the movie. She was an actress, with sadly few credits to her name. She doesn't even have a Wikipedia page. Based on the fact that she gets naked in the movie, I assume that she must have been a Playboy model or something, but she wasn't. She brings a sort of late 1980s beer advert pinup girl energy to the movie. The one sour note in Roadhouse is that Denise is not rescued. We see that she's at the possession, the pet of Wesley's gang. She's the ornament of the entourage. Her striptease in the Double Deuce, a sort of act of defiance against her possession. And yet, She is not liberated from this captivity by Dalton. She's been beaten and abused. We see this. But there's no real room for her in the new improved Joplin, Missouri, once Wesley is defeated, which I think is unfortunate. I understand that our very intelligent and wise protagonist, Dalton, must ultimately end up with a very sophisticated and cosmopolitan woman, but I feel like he should end up with Denise. Oh well. What do I know? Eventually things get so hot that Dalton needs to call in backup, his friend Wade Garrett, a father figure and someone we assume Dalton has learned from. If not his direct teacher, we get the impression that there is a secret priest-like order of bouncers that these men belong to, a vast network of like-minded guardians, just out of sight, like the Jedi, or maybe more like the League of Assassins in the John Wick series.
I know you.
Give me a beer, will you? I'll be back.
Men with a certain code and method of operation. Elliot is awesome in the movie, incredibly rugged and handsome, a glimpse into the man Dalton might become one day if he continues in his line of work. Unfortunately, his only point seems to be to help Dalton fight and then ultimately die, pushing Dalton over the edge and facilitating the film's bloody climax, which is beyond satisfying.
A polar bear fell on me.
I found a great quote from critic David Mesker. Roadhouse is the mother of all stop signs for channel surfers everywhere. No matter how far along the movie is when you stumble upon it, you will put the remote down and watch it to its completion. And you know, I called this the last movie of the 1980s, and I think a symbolic piece of that is that Ronald Reagan, we're not really sure whether or not he watched it, having been released 5 months after the Gipper left office, so it's not on the Library of Congress list of all the movies he watched as president, which is extensive. Would he have liked it, though? Is Gazera's big game hunting bad businessman taken down by a college-educated working man a revolt of the simple people for whom the economy never trickled down as promised? Or simply the story of why being awesome is a force for good, Dalton embodying the American ideology of peace through strength? I tend to think the latter. I tend to think of the new film, too, that just came out on Amazon as sort of in the vein of Craig Brewer's other remake of a 1980s classic, Footloose, which I saw a long time ago when it came out. But I remember the heart and soul just being sucked out of it. It's almost like the producers said, you know, that Dirty Dancing, that was cool. That struck a chord. Let's do it again. But the same chord isn't out there in the culture to be struck. All you can do is just sort of update everything around the movie. Well, the Roadhouse in the middle of Joplin, Missouri, that's not very sexy. What if it was on the beach in, Panama City Beach in Florida? What if it was in the Florida Keys? That'd be a lot cooler. This bar needs to be spruced up. I mean, we need something interesting to look at. This old beat-up barn, not going to do it. But you lose sort of the realism and the heart and the soul of the original film that sort of made it resonate when you simply think of the remake as just like a re-glossed version of the old one. And this new one, I thought, too, was far too self-aware of the movie that it was remaking and its subsequent reputation. They didn't take it as seriously as Patrick Swayze did in those scenes when he's talking to Sam Elliott. He's agonized, he's crying, Swayze's really giving it his all. I felt like Jake Gyllenhaal was leaning too much into trying to emulate the literally me character, and they leaned too much into Gyllenhaal's character with the same problem that plagued the later Daniel Craig Bond films, where instead of exalting this excellent heroic guy with all these talents and abilities, instead the way they describe the existence of such a person is to ascribe to him a pathology. I mean, he must be insane. Something traumatic happened to him to make him the way he is. He's nuts. He's going to Hulk out and go crazy. Of course, obviously, Dalton had his own issues and hang-ups in the original film, but it was always presented as something that he needed to work past and become who he really was, which was a badass action, beat-down badass. And I feel like Gyllenhaal's character in this movie is not someone to emulate or that provides really an example of what it means to be cool or what it means to be masculine, what it means to be competent. It doesn't really resonate. And I think had they tapped into something like that more, if they said, hey, this guy Dalton, he's not just like a freak of nature, weirdo, quirky guy with a screw loose. He's actually somebody awesome that is worthy of emulation. That, I think, would have struck a chord with a lot of younger audiences, especially the male audience, which I guess is what you're going after. But I think that they made it for too broad of an audience. Whereas I feel like the original film was sort of rooted in the sentiments and the feelings of the 1980s, this new one is just sort of feels like it belongs to no time. I think a good example of this is just like the recurring cast of bands that we get in the Roadhouse, which feels like a sort of corporate remit to just include synergies. Oh, let's get all these bands in there and we can sell singles. I'm surprised that the title of the track didn't pop up with a QR code that you could go, boop, oh, I'll buy that one. In the original movie, I mean, they missed a real opportunity to make the band an actual character in the film. And the ham-fisted idea of there being this little quaint seaside bookstore, the woe is me bookstore, that's terrorized by the evil villain who was more like a Silicon Valley prick than he was like the ruthless leader of the town, the big man in town that Ben Gazzara was. In that way, I guess they were trying to keep up with the times, but, I mean, it didn't really work or resonate. I don't know what would make a Roadhouse film resonate in 2024. I don't know what that would be necessarily. And for that, the movie sort of fell flat for me, and I found myself appreciating the old one even more. I think it's a really well-made film by Rowdy Harrington. I think it's dynamic and exciting and colorful and passionate, and there's just terrific action and style. So I appreciate you guys sticking around to watch this review of Roadhouse. If you like my work and you appreciate what I'm doing, likes and subscriptions really help. You can check out my Patreon, and I have links below where you can follow me on X or follow me on Letterboxd to keep up with what I've been watching. But thanks again for coming, and I'll see you guys next time.